Korean dominance is a term coined to express the oppressive reign of Korean players in many esports categories where Koreans are represented. While each game will experience this phenomena differently, the frequency and consistency at which Koreans top the hierarchy of game scenes is now widely recognized and feared as new competitive games emerge and games are marketed as esports titles. One thing to note is that this does not mean Koreans are the best at every game. There are various genres of games or specific titles and series where another region has a tradition of being great at the game or the genre. But for Koreans, while they have their own set of games they excel at, kind of like RTS, I think, that most people think about, their ability to dominate in so many different genres and titles almost seem unreal. As a person who has followed competitive gaming since 2003, I have experienced Korean dominance from early on, but saw widespread international awareness from fans as League of Legends emerged on the scene and Koreans took over that game. And as the casual fans became aware, they started to notice in games that already had Koreans running the scene, and in new games that they were playing, they saw it with a lens, just looking for Koreans just in case, seeing if they could dominate that game as well. Korean dominance has existed before League of Legends, but I highlight the game in this section for one reason. This term was coined with this game in mind and looked at originally with this game in mind. So the explanation for this Korean dominance as teams try to emulate the success of Koreans in League of Legends was heavily tied to it. The three main factors that are tossed around for Koreans' ability to excel at competitive games are team infrastructure, preset hierarchy due to culture, and work ethic. While I do think these have valid reasons and are contributing factors to why Koreans dominate in games like League of Legends or Overwatch, I don't think it fully explains the phenomena properly. First one, team infrastructure, implies that due to the pre-existing team house system and coaching staff from previous titles and games, organizations like KESPA for regulations, companies like OGN that broadcast the games, or large corporations that are used to sponsoring big Korean teams for esports all help jumpstart the professional scene when a new game comes out and helps create a professional environment faster than other regions. The main problem I have with this is that while it does help develop talent to the next level by giving new talent a professional and structured environment and having them become familiar with organized style of play, these infrastructures only helps those players after they become good enough to join a team and learn under the Korean esports infrastructure. This factor doesn't explain why so many talents are able to rise up in solo rank systems and why so many players are able to become so good before joining any teams. The second one, culture, implies that since Koreans have a culture where they set a hierarchy based on age, it's easier to create order in teams. According to this factor, younger players that are up and coming are more likely to listen to the veterans and older players. Players are more likely to listen to the authority figures like coaches and managers who are likely to be older than the players. The assumption is that this makes it easier for coaches to handle players. I think in some ways this can definitely help a team be more cohesive, but the main problem I have with attributing Korean success with this is that it doesn't help in those games where it isn't a team game. There's many 1v1 games that Koreans excel at, despite not having big communities, and in these games, this type of culture isn't going to make a big difference. Adding on, it makes very little difference in my opinion when you are honing your skills individually, which is going back to the same argument as the previous factor. When players are in solo queue environments or ranked systems, they're playing by themselves and honing their skills, getting better on their own. And the respect for elders doesn't explain a player's ability. The last one, work ethic, implies that since Asians and Koreans included are such hardworking people that they naturally do better since they try harder, for longer, and more earnestly. While I'm not going to say that hard work isn't important, Korea isn't the only country that's labeled with people that have good work ethics. There's many other countries, not just Asian countries, there's many European countries that also have this like label placed on them. And once again, I do want to note that this factor probably does help Koreans excel at many things, including games. I just don't think it's the main reason, because if that was the case, there's many other cultures that have this idea as well, a lot of good work ethic, but it can't be just Koreans that are good if this was the factor. Before I make more statements, I would like to make some notes on who I am and what kind of experiences I had so far, because the next set of statements I'll be talking about will have to do with my experience with Koreans and non-Koreans, and Koreans that are considered, I guess, Twinkies, people who are Koreans but are very un-Korean, mostly very Western influenced. Because I'm a Korean American math teacher. I spent most of my childhood growing up in America in an area without a lot of Asians. But I went to an all Korean church and I had a lot of interaction with FOB Koreans, or Koreans who act very Korean. Later in my life, I also moved to area with large Asian community, so I had a lot of experiences with, I guess, Twinkie Koreans as well as FOB Koreans, and just other Asians in general who are in that spectrum as well. Mostly Chinese because I live in New York. Um, as I studied to be a teacher, I also taught in very different communities where there's very little Asians or no Koreans, and I also dealt with students who are FOB Koreans, and I dealt with a lot of students who were Twinkie Koreans. And from my experiences going through a lot of students in my, what's that, 6 years now, 7 years of teaching, I dealt with several hundreds of different students with different backgrounds, and I have a lot of experiences dealing with especially Koreans because I taught a lot in Korean schools, well, like after schools and academies, as well as teaching in public schools. And if you give me maybe 2 or 3 more years, I'll probably hit about 1,000 students that I've dealt with in my profession. And even outside my profession, I dealt with a large number of Koreans and non-Koreans in churches. I went to Korean churches, I went to non-Korean churches, and as a student myself in schools, I was in a lot of activities that had a lot of Koreans and had no Koreans. And from those experiences, also, I try to look at patterns and different ways I notice people learn and like to learn. And from my experience, I've come to generalize a few patterns that I see in FOB Koreans that I don't see in Twinkie Koreans or just non Koreans and non Asians. And I saw huge differences in patterns that appear as they try to learn things. And I believe these are bigger factors and more important factors as to why Koreans produce higher level for the most part in games that they choose to play. The first thing I noticed in a lot of Koreans that are FOBs that I dealt with is that Koreans love games that are competitive. They need some sort of ladder or PvP system that's built into the game, and even gamers at a casual level like playing games that are more competitive or have some sort of PvP system. I think the reason for this could be a mix of things, but generally, with people that are FOB Koreans that I played with and seen, they tend to gravitate towards those kind of games. On the other hand, FOB Koreans, especially those that play games more casually, seems to avoid single player games that are just the game experience, sometimes calling it a waste of time or meant for younger audience. This is why if you look at a lot of the games that come out of Korea, like look at MMORPGs or even phone games, they tend to have a big emphasis on PvP and some sort of ranking system. And they choose to balance their games so that PvP is something that you could do and it's something that's almost as important as PvE in their game and their other content. In the flip side, if I look at a lot of games that come out of like Japan or from Western companies, I feel like they have really heavy emphasis on just the PvE and the content, and I feel like sometimes the PvP is kind of tacked on afterwards using their system. And I'm pretty sure you could find games that are counter to this narrative, but if you think about all the list of the games that you played, I think you'll see some sort of pattern that matches this. The second factor I think that makes it more likely Koreans become better at games faster and better is the fact that Koreans have to do things the right way. Now, this idea of doing things the right way isn't always a good thing. As a teacher, I ran into a lot of problems because I'm not particularly a fob myself. I lean more towards Twinkies, and I noticed a lot of fob Koreans when you teach them something, they don't want you to just teach them and give you a lot of options to do things. Like in math, there are a lot of ways to solve a certain question, but fob Koreans often ask for the best way of doing it or the most concise way of doing it. Or when I'm teaching them literature and we're reading stuff and trying to interpret literature, I had a lot of difficulty with even college students who were trying to interpret a text and looking for that one right correct message that the author must have been trying to convey instead of trying to make meaning of it themselves, kind of like if they were reading a fable or something. I think this type of thinking is something a lot of Koreans deal with and sometimes struggle in certain areas because of it. But in terms of video games, this type of thinking helps Koreans quite a lot. Another thing that you will notice if you're around a lot of pop Koreans is that they are very susceptible to fads. And one thing I experienced a lot while I was in churches and school groups that had a lot of pop Koreans is the flavor of the month sports that catch on as fads. There were a lot of flavor of the month sports where everyone picked up and played a new sport for about a month and played it together. And unlike in other communities where if this happened, where a lot of people would just show up in casual clothing or jeans, people show up dressed normal, like how they always dress when they hang out. In my experience with Pop Koreans, a lot of people will arrive fully geared, like they're being sponsored by a team to play that sport. There were times when we played some of the sports that I play regularly as my hobby, and some of the Koreans came geared better than me, despite being completely newbies at the sport. This happens because Koreans research the sport in order to do things the correct way. They watch the highest level and try to emulate it to the best of their abilities. In some ways, this can hurt their learning process as beginners and make things harder, but this is the pattern that I do observe. Similarly, Koreans are more likely to read up guides and do research on a game to make the right decisions and play as optimally as possible. Even in games like MMORPGs, where it isn't particularly competitive, it is expected in Korean communities that you look up everything about the game. Unlike the experience I had in global servers, where a lot of times people are learning in the dungeon to clear it and going in blind, despite it being old content, Koreans expect any player going in to know how to run it. If you call someone out for not knowing it, you get called a tryhard in global servers. You're taking away the fun from the players. In Korean servers, you're in the wrong for joining the dungeon while not knowing anything about it. Same for its theory crafting and builds. I saw way too many players in global servers who had no idea how to build a character because they didn't understand how the game and system worked at all, mostly guessing and doing what they want. While I noticed FOB Koreans would probably learn about the whole game before they even touch it to pre-plan everything they were going to do, they wanted to figure out the game and play it correctly. Another way this idea manifests is even for a lower level player in a video game. Koreans are likely to play in competitive modes if that's how it's meant to be played. This happens if a game's main way of playing is the competitive game mode or that's the main way of playing against another player. And for the Koreans, that is the correct way that the devs meant the game to be played. For example, League of Legends is balanced to be played in draft mode in 5v5 Summoner's Rift in ranked, where everyone's trying their best to win, because that is how the game was designed to be played and what the devs focus on. Koreans will, regardless of play level or how casual you are, almost always play in ranked draft mode in League of Legends. Unlike a lot of non Korean friends I have, where they rather play normal modes or ARAM due to the pressure of playing ranked or because they just want to mess around, which is quite funny considering my non Korean friends are better than some of my Korean friends, but insist on playing normals while my bronze friends want to dual rank. Additionally, this idea of having to play the correct way also manifests in their idea of fun, where part of the Koreans' argument is that if you aren't playing the game the right way and don't enjoy the game when being played right, you shouldn't play that game. Because of all of this, Korean servers will tend to have a higher ratio of people who play the game in the competitive mode, so there's more chances for these people to get to a higher rank in competitive. It'll be more competitive because more people are playing it, and because a lot of people are trying to learn the game and understand it to a higher level. In general, I don't mean that even the lowest level player has a higher understanding than the high ranked players in other servers. I'm just saying for each of the rank, I expect the Korean player to just have a bigger understanding because they're more likely to be looking up stuff that are above their level. But also this feeling of needing to play the game correctly and as the devs intended can become counterproductive in certain games. I think one type of game that's kind of competitive that Koreans are not inclined to play are speedrunning, where you don't really hear about Koreans topping in any games for speedrunning, is because it's not the way the devs intend you to play. These are like community built rules, so they are less inclined to play those games to begin with because it's not competitive, but it's also not the quote unquote right way to play anyway for them. So they are less inclined to play games to speedrun. The last factor I think that differentiates Koreans and probably other Asians from non Asians is that they have a bigger tendency to become obsessive about their hobby. I'm not saying that non Koreans or non Asians never become obsessive about something, but I think the frequency and severity of it is abnormally high in Korea. In the West, a lot of the symptoms that are normalized from Asian perspective are considered a mental disease or a disorder with its own term for each symptom. In Korea, we just say you fell into something and it's considered normal. You expect it to happen to a certain point if it's a hobby that's fun. While I don't think this will be as big of a factor as esports gets bigger, I think right now this helps Koreans have an edge due to how our scene is. Most scenes are made up of undisciplined youths trying to make something out of their hobby as their growth in it feels more satisfying than other areas of their lives. Being this obsessive allows players to grind harder and longer compared to people who are not obsessed about the game. Because if you no longer feel good about your rate of growth or you feel like the game feels like work, you lose your internal motivation. On top of that, there isn't a lot of external motivation that happens in esports. If anything, a lot of your family members and relatives will try to, for the most part, unmotivate you as you try to become a professional gamer. Due to this, I think without the obsessive nature being internal in a person, players in esports are more susceptible to burnout. And people who are obsessed can stay in the game longer and grind harder and continue to become better at the game, as a lot of Asians, Koreans included, easily become this obsessed about a game. I think it is one of the big reasons why there are a lot of Asian players who can grind so much and become very good at the game. So, in my opinion, these factors are bigger culprits that constantly create strong contenders in various esports titles in Korea than the first three that usually goes around in the industry. I'm not saying that having a head start in infrastructure didn't help, or that there aren't some cultural differences that help Koreans, or that Korean work ethic don't play some role. I just think there are bigger factors that actually makes Koreans become individually better at a lot of the games that they play. And when people are trying to emulate the Korean success by thinking up those first set of three factors that as esports organizations can actually emulate, I think it kind of misses why we have so many individually good players to begin with. So in my opinion, the three factors that makes Koreans so good at different esports title is the fact that Korean gaming communities gravitate towards the types of games that we would consider esports. Their idea of doing things correctly leads a larger portion of their player base towards the competitive realm provided by the devs, and players try their best to emulate the highest level of play. And a lot more people are able to go further due to their common obsessive nature and continue to do so because they play for longer periods of time and they play with harder intensity. Thank you for listening to my video. If you believe nothing about what I said in this video, that's completely fine. That's up to you. Um, as someone who had the experience that I had, just want to get this off my chest and let some people know because I think there is a tendency for people to over idolize Koreans in esports because they just do so good and they only want to talk about what makes them so great. And I think some of the factors I handed out do help them in esports, but I don't think they're particularly good traits as people. So I think it's something that is not said by the Koreans a lot because we don't want to make other Koreans look bad, and it's not something that a lot of people, other non-Koreans, would just say because it makes Koreans look bad and they don't want to feel like they're racist or anything. Um, don't subscribe to me because of this because there are a few things that I do want to make videos about, but it's not like I'm gonna make videos in a regular what's that interval. So don't subscribe to me. Don't follow me on anything.